for those who don't know me, my name is Heather Blumenthal, the Executive Director of the Cape Town Holocaust and Genocide Center, and it is really my pleasure to welcome our special guest speaker, Chava Erlanger, for what I believe will be a very interesting lecture. Chava is the granddaughter of Holocaust survivors, both on her maternal and paternal side of her family. She grew up in Israel before moving to Switzerland and Belgium, followed by the United Kingdom, where she settled in Manchester 20 years ago. Chava studied art in Belgium, and then after the birth of her third child, Chava obtained a BA in Art and Design from Manchester Metropolitan University. Her art is very much an exploration of Jewish identity and history. She focused her research on the effects of trauma on Holocaust survivors' families, with a particular focus on the effect of the Holocaust on the second and third generation. And I'm happy to see that we have got some second and third generation survivors within our audience. A substantial aspect in Chava's work as an artist is being involved in the community. She uses art as a facilitator and a tool to help people cope with loss and trauma, as well as life challenges such as mental health, dementia, anxiety, etc. Over the past 10 years, Chava has accumulated a wealth of experience in delivering therapeutic art workshops to Holocaust survivors and refugees, helping them to capture these stories by using art as a non-verbal expression of their experience and at the same time documenting history. During her work on the project Latent Memories, she worked with the likes of the UK Holocaust Memorial Fund on their urgent testimony project. She identified individuals suitable for recording and helped to coordinate and facilitate recordings in the Northwest alongside Natasha Kaplinsky and Atlantic Productions. Chava has exhibited her work at prominent locations, including the Imperial War Museum North, and has designed stained glass windows for the Steencourt Synagogue in Manchester. As with previous webinars, our team will switch off your cameras and mute audio for the duration of the talk. I will be moderating our question and answer session at the end of the lecture. So I urge you to type in your questions either in the chat or the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. And so it gives me great pleasure to hand over to you, Chava.
Hi, Heather. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining. Thank you, Heather, for asking me to do this webinar presentation. It is a real honor and responsibility for me to work with survivors and refugees and to carry the task of making sure the stories are told and learning lessons from the Holocaust. I find it always a very humbling experience to work with refugees and survivors, usually extraordinary people. Although tonight we're going to speak about those which have managed to build their lives and make an extraordinary existence, life, and continuation for themselves, as well as we'll talk about the survivors which unfortunately have never mentally or physically left the camps or the war, because not only those which have actually been to concentration camps have suffered, they're not the only ones that suffer trauma. There's always people say to me, survivors very often, but I haven't been in the camps, but they also suffer with trauma and loss, especially here in the UK. Many of the survivors arrived here on their own, been taken away from their parents on the kinder transport or through other visa arrangements, and they were torn from their childhood and from their past and brought to a new country. And that trauma of separation and being left alone still lives with them till today. And the first slide that you see here, lesson I've learned from work with survivors over the years. You can see two images which I've drawn actually after some sessions working with survivors. The first one you can see individual, I've left no face on them with a barbed wire around them. You can also notice the pearl necklace around their neck. which is for me sort of the combination of people which have a lot of dignity. I was working with a lady, she was an Auschwitz survivor, and she always had her pearls, very immaculate, but mentally she was still in the camps. She could not bring, everywhere she went, everything she did during her life was the reference to Auschwitz and the camps. You'd give her food, and the first reaction was, in the camps, we didn't have food. She was very careful about her dignity and being always immaculate. And she always said to me, I'm wearing pearls always. I don't go anywhere without my pearls, because in the camps, we couldn't have our dignity. And really, if I think about it, the most common subject that I hear from survivors always is the fact that what's really the greatest long-lasting effect of the Holocaust on them and the trauma is the fact that the basic human rights for cleanliness, for food, for clothing has been stripped away. And I think it's a very important thing to remember, and we'll get back to that during the webinar. The other image, you can see a person, a lady, again, and there's the blue and white stripes on her face, which shows that her thoughts are always still being a prisoner. It's very hard to move away for a lot of individuals. Again, it's not every survivor, but a lot of survivors found it very hard to get out of the camps. And as the famous quote says, only those who died have seen the end of war. And I think this is very, very true. I'll Justine, if you don't mind, next slide. The way I'm going to present this webinar is I thought I'll tell you stories of some of the individuals that I was very fortunate and humbled and lucky, perhaps. I don't know if lucky is the right word, to work with. I'll show you some short clips, some images, and I'll talk you through them. This is the first. We'll start with Mr. Lipschitz. I will explain, because some of the words are in Yiddish. So if you don't speak Yiddish, don't worry about that. I will explain the film. The film is not very loud. It was recorded on a phone during an art therapy session. So please put your volume higher when you're listening to it. Justine.
I'm ready. Hello, I was a 14-year-old boy when we were on the march from Mauthausen to Gunskirchen. I kept a little piece of bread in my rucksack for a rainy day. Morning comes and it's pinched. Somebody has taken it. I was very, very upset. Many, many years I was upset about it. And now I realize that it was a zechis for me, that somebody took it. I survived without it, I'm here. But the person who took it may not have survived. And if that saved his life and survived the war and married children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, that would be my zechis. And I wish that somebody would, that the fellow would own up, or if he's still around, or mentioned it to his children, I would like to be in person to forgive them with my full heart. I'm ready.
Okay, Justine, can we pause? Thank you, Justine.
Hello,
just a second. Okay, so this is Mr. Lipschitz. Mr. Lipschitz was unfortunately passed away about just before COVID. He was a very extraordinary individual. He went through 3 or 4 concentration camps. And this recording you just heard, he's talking about an incident that happened on the march of the death march from one camp to the next. So he tells in the story how he hid a little piece of bread in his pocket or whatever it was. And he fell asleep and someone stole this bread. Now, he told me, and I've heard it, from his mouth, face to face, he said to me, and you could see he was still for a long, long time. He said all his life, whenever he ate a piece of bread, he remembered this person that stole the bread. And he said that he could never forgive him. And this film was recorded about a half a year before he passed away. And he was very determined. He kept on asking me, please, can you post this video on Facebook? He said on your social media, as he put it. He wanted, if the person was still alive, to come and ask him forgiveness. He said to me, after all these years, he realized that he survived the war, and maybe that piece of bread has helped another individual to survive the war. And he wanted to personally meet this person if he's alive and ask him forgiveness for feeling so bitter and angry for him stealing that, if you can call it stealing, that piece of bread. And I thought it shows, and it's unbelievable to both sides of it. One is the fact that all his life he bared a grudge for the person for stealing the bread, which you can understand. Again, I asked him once, he said to me, I said, people talk about heroism in the camps. And he said, let's face it. We were reduced down to animals. We were just, everybody was fighting for the next piece of bread, the next sip of soup, whatever was available. And I thought it was just to see that a person after all those years of anger wants to go and ask forgiveness for someone for stealing the bread. That shows a lot of, I think a very special person, and how it also shows how actually the things that made people, the dehumanizing of people is taking away your basic rights, like for bread. He told me another story, which on the other hand, which he said he never forgived. He said when they were working on the March of the Dead, he was with his father. And some villagers on the way gave his father a spoon of honey and said, give this to your son. His father ate the spoon of honey. He was obviously exhausted. And another man standing next to him said to his father, what type of a father are you? How can you eat the honey when your little child is hungry? He said to me, Mr. Lipschitz, all my life I don't forgive this man. How could he embarrass and humiliate my father like this? My father was hungry. His father never survived the war. Mr. Lipschitz's father never survived the war. However, he said he could never forgive this person because he found it, he said, he embarrassed and hurt my father. And again, I'm talking about people being able to keep their dignity to a certain extent. That's something that was so important for him. So both sides, he wanted to ask forgiveness for somebody that he was angry with them for stealing his bread, but the dignity and the pride of his father, he wanted to protect. Next slide, please. Okay, so in this slide, the first time I met Mr. Lipschitz, which actually only told his story on the Urgent Testimony project, and he said to me something which I found, again, he was one of the most inspiring individuals I've ever met. I said, why have you never told your story before? He said, how could I do this to my wife and family? They couldn't cope with so much suffering. I thought it's better to bring them up in a very nice life and keep the trauma and the pain away from them. So when I arrived in his house, he pulled out this bar of soap, which is soap made from human fat from Auschwitz. And he said to me, here, take it. And I said to him, I really don't want to touch this because it just didn't sit right with me. And I said, you should really bury it. It's human remains. And he told me the story behind it. He said, I take this in my pocket everywhere. And I said, I asked him, why would you do that? And he said to me something I will never forget. He said, my mom died in Auschwitz. There's a tiny little chance that my mother, this is part of my mother. I could never get rid of my mother. This gives me the feeling my mom is with me. He said, I'm not going to bury it. It's going to be buried with me. He said, a museum offered me a lot of money. He said, would you ever sell your mom? He said, this might be part of my mom. And he took it with him everywhere. And I think it just shows the depth of the pain the war has left on survivors. I mean, 86-year-old man still walking around with a bar of soap, hoping there's a little link, the only thing he thinks might have a remainder of his mum. And I think when it comes to Holocaust education and the importance of telling the story of the Holocaust, this for me is one of the strong stories, small stories, which explains me why it's so important, because it's not about being Jewish. Holocaust education is not about being Jewish. It's not about being a family of Holocaust survivors. It's really about humanity and realizing how when you hurt someone, how the ripple effect it has, and how it's really about the basic human needs of having parents, being loved, having food. And I think this little bar of soap says it all. And that's why it's so important for us as individuals to talk about the Holocaust, but also for, I don't talk politics, but for governments and countries to realize that when you go to war, the pain you inflict goes much further than the moment you inflict it on one another. Next slide, please. Okay, so I'll touch a bit here and there about the artwork and the work I do. with survivors, letting them express their emotions and the trauma through art. So this is a piece done again by Mr. Lipschitz, and he wanted to do a family tree. Now, if you look at the image at the bottom, there's no roots. And I said to Mr. Lipschitz, you know, family tree, usually people do the roots, you know, the grandparents, great-grandparents. And he said to me, there is no roots. My roots were all wiped out in the camps. I'm the only one that survived from my family. My parents, everybody, his father died just as the war finished. His mom and his siblings were killed in Auschwitz. He said, there is no roots. I'm starting from scratch. And he was very proud, obviously. He spent a lot of time creating this piece of work. He said, look, they tried to wipe us out, but it didn't work. I'm still here. And I've started from this. He put a picture, as you can see at the bottom, of what he called a Zalmenu, so a survivor coming out of the camps, you know, weighing not much. Then there's an image of him when he arrived in England. And then there's an image of his wedding and all the branches. He left behind a really large family. And he always said to me, this is what I fought for. When I came out of the camps, I promised myself I'll rebuild the family. And he told me often, I used to see him once a week. And he told me often, it's important for me for people to know that it was much easier for me not to build a life, not to succeed. He said, the trauma was so great. He said, being left in the world all on your own, your family is wiped out. He arrived in a new country with nothing, no money, no family, no prospects. Everything you know is gone. He said to become a nothing was a greater option than becoming a something. And I think it teaches us a lot about human resilience and our abilities we have to overcome despite trauma. And despite pain, we do have the abilities. And I think that's if one of the main lessons I've learned from all the survivors I've worked with that have managed to build a life is they have found that inner strength to overcome their challenges, whatever it is. And we all have our challenges, our difficulties. But when I look at this image, I think if he could rebuild himself after the hell he's gone through, and so many others, not everybody managed to, we all can take lessons from that and find a strength within us to build our lives and to move forward despite pain and despite suffering. Next slide, please. And as we said before, please feel free to put any questions, thoughts you have in the chat, and we'll go through them later. Okay, next person is Sonia. Next slide, please. Okay, Sonia is a survivor, again, which has never told a story until about 5 years ago. Sonia is an interesting one because she is a Holocaust survivor as well as a second generation, meaning she was a very young girl in the war. She was about 2-3 years old when the war broke out and she went into hiding in Holland. But her parents went to Auschwitz. Her mother went to Auschwitz and her father was actually not Jewish. He was underground, anti-government, anti-Nazi fighter in Holland. I forgot the right word because I have it in Dutch, so I do apologize. So Sonia's parents went to the camps and came back from the camps as survivors, and Sonia was ripped away from her family and put into hiding during the war. Now, she was very hesitant to talk about her stories and also about her right to be called a survivor. And when she told me that, I said something, my grandmother. So I have, unfortunately, I lost my last surviving grandmother a year ago. Oh, I was lucky to have a grandmother for so long, if I can say that. And I told her what my grandmother, which was in Auschwitz, my mother's mum, Irene Ross, what she told me always when people said about how much did you suffer in the war? And she told me something really important, which I try to remember always when I work with people and tell my children as well. She said, how do you measure suffering? By time, by space, by enormity. Everyone's suffering has a value, and everyone's suffering is relative to where they are in life. And I think that's something really important for us to remember. And I use that a lot. And I said to Sonia, you have suffered, she's been taken away. She has a phenomenal memory. And considering she never actually watched war films and she could remember things she saw through the windows in Amsterdam, where a lot of the killing was taking place. I've decided not to show them today because they're very traumatic and unpleasant. And I thought I will focus on this image of a little girl. So Sonia drew herself just before she was given back from her, where she was hiding, to her parents. Now, they had to pay a ransom to bring her back because although people were very happy to hide children during the war for whatever reasons they were, whether it was they wanted to convert them to Christianity or rather out of the goodness of their heart, whatever the reasons were, when it came to return children back in Holland, there's a lot of stories about people not wanting to give the children back naturally. You have adopted a child, brought them up to 4 or 5 years or whatever time it was. And she had a blue velvet dress on. And when her father came to collect her, they said to her, we'll give her back to you, but we want her dress and her red shoes back. They're very expensive and we want them back. You can't have those. Otherwise, you can't have Sonia back. So she has those 2 big men, obviously from, we record history from children's point of view. They strip her out of her dress and her shoes and she goes home to her father and mother in her underwear and her socks. And she said till today, one of the main memories she has from the war is losing her blue velvet dress and her red shoes. And I think, again, if we talk about how do we destroy someone, how do we, what are the things? I think the thing about the Holocaust is, if I may say so, is the enormity of the killing and the enormity of the tragedy as a collective, as a nation, and as a world was too big for people to grasp in a way in the beginning. But the memories, what survivors tell me, the things that they still remember and hurt them are usually small things, what defines humanity and dignity, like this little blue dress and the red shoes. And those are the things that really still disturb her a lot. Obviously, she suffers from other traumas, which is happy for me to share with you. She's an unbelievable individual. Again, talking about someone that's fights for her life. She still works as a beautician. She still volunteers. She travels back to Holland where she lives on a regular basis. So she's really a very inspiring individual with a fighting spirit. But she always says the main, except of the trauma of obviously being hidden. So she's very scared of small spaces. COVID was a big challenge, being locked at home. A lot of survivors were calling in to say, well, we're trapped at home. And that's something that's still really strongly left behind with her. But the main thing is being stripped from your childhood, those little things. Next slide, please. Okay, this slide, this is an image which was created by an Auschwitz survivor, and I'll tell you the story behind it. And again, this will demonstrate how when you inflict pain on someone, the aftermath of it is much greater than the point you inflicted. It goes on for generations, affects the generations to come. It goes on for a lifetime for people. And actually, if we talk about a lesson from that, I'll explain in a minute what's on the plate, is that we have to think before we hurt someone, before we do an action. Our actions have a ripple effect. They're much greater. We have a responsibility as people, whether it's something, people speak about bullying, racism, just hate crimes, whatever it is, our actions have a greater effect than we realize on others. And it's a responsibility for us as individuals and as nations. So this was Mrs. Eckstein. She was a Auschwitz survivor, a little tiny little Hungarian lady with more jewelry than you can ever see. And again, one of those women, she said, I was in the camps, we had no clothes and no jewelry, and she got dressed every day in her silks and her jewelry. It was fantastic to see. Again, just and proving that she always used to say, I'm still a woman despite what they have done to me. She came into a care home. She needed care, and she wouldn't go out of her room. So I was asked to go into the room, said, can you have a word with her, maybe do a bit of art therapy with her, see if we can get to understand why she's refusing to leave her room. So I came in and I said, Mrs. Eckstein, let's go out, we have some tea, coffee, let's go out to the main room, see some people. And the first sentence she said to me is, this place is like the concentration camps. And I said, what do you mean? Everybody's really nice here. Explain. She said, they tell me when to eat, when to go to sleep, when to get dressed, how to get dressed. This is what they did for us in the camps. I'm not a human being anymore. So you can see how the care regime, which was just what she needed, brought back such trauma to what happened in the camps, although it was done out of care. So I said to her, let's sit around and do a bit of drawing. So as you can see in the middle, she drew the gate of Auschwitz camp, and there's two little black dots on the top, in the middle of the gate. And she said, that's her on the floor without clothes and the Nazis laughing at her. She wouldn't say any more, but that's, that was okay for her. That's how she wanted to express her feeling of being trapped. And then she wrote on the plate, as you can see, look, where are you? And Baruch Hashem, thank goodness, where we are today, Am Yisrael Chai. Look where we are nowadays, Am Yisrael Chai. The Jewish nation carries on. And after that, she was okay. So it's quite amazing, the power of actually talking and saying how you feel. Again, she wasn't one that spoke about her experience, but also the effect of trauma on someone and the length that it affects someone. I think I was quite taken aback when she said that. And I remember going home that day and thinking, you know what, we really, really have a responsibility. And I think it's quite scary, really, to think that I'm saying that as a third generation survivor, and the way I feel the war still affects myself as an individual. It's quite scary how, you hurt one person and how it goes on. I've also done some work with research on birth defects and pregnancy difficulties. I'm going off the topic again, but it's just very interesting. And they're doing research now on the way trauma affects not only your mental state, but affects the physical health of a fetus, of an embryo, of a child in the womb through paternal trauma and maternal trauma. So just a very interesting thing is actually now they think evidence to show it changes the well-being, the physical well-being of an individual. And I think that's fascinating, and it might explain a lot of what second and third generations survivors are dealing with nowadays, as well as survivors themselves. Next slide, please. Walter. So Walter was a Kindertransport. To those of you who might not know, the Kindertransport was a train that came from Austria and Germany, Holland, I think as well, through Holland, and brought children into the UK for refuge. The parents were not allowed, were not granted entry to the UK, and they came on their own. So we'll play this little clip and then I will go through the story. Next slide, please.
14 here now. I didn't know anything about anything. I could hardly look after myself, never mind after a young girl of 6. So she didn't trust me. If she would have known what's going to happen, she would have come, because there were babies coming without anybody, rolled in blankets and sheets and nothing like this. What can I do? Nothing you could do about it. Have you taken all the pictures? No. 14 here now. I didn't know anything.
Thank you, Justine. Okay. Walter, so I met Walter in a care home, as you might see from the setting in Manchester. Walter was very, very tall, if I may say, a real Germanic gentleman, a real gentleman. And in his hands, he has a picture of his sister. Walter never had children. He had a lovely marriage, but he had never had children. And all his life, he carried the guilt of not having a sister with coming to the UK. So you can imagine the guilt of, it was survivor's guilt, I suppose, but also he said, if my mother only knew that I could save my sister, she would have let me take her with me. And I think it's, again, every single day he would take this picture in his hand and talk about the fact that he never saved his sister, could have saved his sister. And I think one of the things a lot of survivors which came to the UK told me is the government made our parents choose. Now, again, I'm not going into politics, but I'm just putting the thought out there. It's a piece of paper. Could England, which was the closest country to Europe, allow more kids? Was it necessary to be so strict about visas? I don't know. But it does raise a question about how, and that's what survivors always tell me. And again, survivors are very split about refugees in the UK. It's very interesting. You have the ones which say, bring them all in, and the other ones that say, don't let them in, you know, and which is quite surprising. But I'm saying people are still people despite what they went through. But people had to do unbelievable choices. And again, individuals like Walter had to live with the guilt of being, you know, survivor's guilt all their lives for being the chosen one to go abroad. And obviously, I'm sure if his parents had any idea what was going on, they would have, you know, probably sent his sister with him. Again, Walter was an individual, despite all his trauma. He built, you know, he had a big business of handbags. That was a big industry here. Cloth and handbags were a big industry in the UK. Manchester especially, it's quite interesting if we're talking about resilience and the will or need to build yourself from scratch. So the industry, the cloth and the handbag industry, so anything to do with cloth and leather, was mainly revived by Holocaust survivors and refugees, which arrived here and had the urge to build their lives again, whether it's financially or just to, you know, to build financial imperias or just working for the community. And I always wonder when I listen to people's story, where does someone that's gone through so much trauma and suffering take the resilience to push themselves forward? And it's just an open question. And I had this question. Some of my work, I also go and do some lectures in prisons. And just before COVID, again, COVID changed our lives. I went to a prison, local male prison, and I spoke to people about life choices. And I gave them the example of Mr. Lipschitz, for example, which always told me it was easier for me not to have a life than to have a life. And I got very angry reactions from the prisoners saying, but they had choices, we don't. And I don't believe, I think there are some people, and that's what I've learned working with survivors, which don't have the ability to and the strength to get over trauma and pain. But I think most people have it in them and have the ability, but and the power to overcome suffering. And I think we all have that little bit of ability with help and support. So that's a bigger point to look at, but I think it's quite interesting a point to think, how come survivors generally, there's 2 points that has been researched. How come survivors have been so successful, the ones which have been successful? I always say for every individual survivor that has been very successful, there's another one which hasn't managed to build their lives. But a lot of them, they are extraordinary successful individuals. So I don't know, it's something that's still being researched. And I find if anybody has ideas, I would like to hear that in the chat as well. Next slide, please. Susan, okay. Susan came from France. We'll show you a little clip of video and then we'll continue.
I just cannot. I've tried in my brain and I can't remember the journey back in Paris from that village where we landed.
That's interesting.
And my grandmother, I had grandma, grandpa, and my auntie, my uncle, another auntie, my cousin, mother, and my sister and I. We all walked with the Germans, with their machine guns, trying to kill us on the roads.
Were people killed on the way?
Oh yes, I've seen people dead. We jumped in the
ditch.
What do you call ditches? Yes. But it was luck. Everything. Why I'm here today? It's luck. It's luck. Well, they took my grandmother. They took my aunties, uncles, cousins.
Trying to understand. I spoke to you last time about it. Why would anybody be so cruel to another human being? Can you understand it?
No, I don't. I don't, because it's not me. It's not in my nature. But they were brainwashed. They were. So a lot of the German people were. Some of them didn't want to do what they did. But how can one man brainwash a population like that? That's amazing.
It's frightening, isn't it?
Yeah. It could happen again, I suppose, but you've got to keep talking about it so it doesn't. Just cannot have.
Thank you, Justine. Okay, Susan passed away about 2-3 months ago. She was 94. And as you can hear, she was from France. She always used to tell me, Chava, I don't know how people know I'm French. So yeah, heavy French accent. And I think one thing I've learned from Susan, as you could hear in the film, that she always said, I don't think everyone wanted to do what they've done. And I think to be able to give a benefit of the doubt and see good in people is an unbelievable thing to do when your whole family is wiped away, when you have to travel, leave your homes. She was hidden during the war in several places, lost, most of her family were wiped out in the war. And I think that's an unbelievable quality and ability to have, despite all the pain, to still say, you know what, maybe they didn't mean it, maybe they were forced, maybe they were just young people. And I think I had a very interesting thought that went through my head. I think the first war criminal, again, without politics, just facts, facts that we heard on the news, the first Russian soldier was sentenced for life for war crimes in Ukraine. And he said, I did not want to do this. I was given orders. And the first thought that came to my head is things that Susan told me, they didn't all mean it. And I don't know what the answer is. And the other thing she said, I suppose it can happen again. Yes, it's a lie to say that the Holocaust can't happen again. I think the reason we need to talk about it, the Holocaust can happen again. And that's a sentence I heard more and more from survivors, which tell me time after time, the ones which are still alive and the ones that passed away and I spoke to said, make sure, they always used to tell me, you heard it from us. You make sure the story continues because it can happen again and it will happen again if we don't educate, if we don't talk. I think the only a bit of comfort nowadays is social media, which means I think information travels faster. Perhaps it will stop something as big as the Holocaust to ever happen again. But unfortunately, we see what's happening in Ukraine again. So again, it's a question that I don't know what the answer for it is, but I think the responsibility is to really make sure everybody knows about it and it never happens again, and that it's not a Jewish problem, the Holocaust. It's a humanitarian, it's a crime against humanity, which was at that time against Jewish people. It could happen to anyone again. And again, the benefit of the doubt and seeing good in everyone, which is a really important message I hear over and over from survivors. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is Susan again with her dolls. Now, I want to talk a bit about childhood and the trauma of war. There is a Jewish philosophy. As I said, I'm not a religious artist, but I am religious. So in the Torah, it does say that by the age of 6, your personality is formed. And most of and I think psychologically, we also talk about it, by the age of 6, the early years are very crucial and critical for our mental and physical well-being and development. And most of us have our dreams, our thoughts, our personality formed in a very young age of 6. When a war comes and tears that away, it doesn't only take away the actual years of your childhood, it takes away and shatters your dreams, your hopes. And that's why the pain of the war and the trauma is so much outreach. It reaches so much further than we realize, because when a child, like Susan said to me, when she was about 14, the war finished, you have to rebuild your life from scratch because everything you dreamt and wanted and those crucial years of building yourself as a person are gone. Those 2 dolls were dolls she had as a child, and they were displayed with a lot of pride in her middle of a living room. Now, the dolls were not in such good condition, where they were hidden during the war, and her children, as a gift for 80th birthday, I think, restored them and gave it to her as a gift again. So they were all looked, and she said to me, all looked nice and new. And she said to me that those are one of the most precious things that they managed to rescue during the war. And with talking to survivors during the war, very often they would talk about the doll they missed. I said, nobody said to me they missed their gold cutlery or the crockery or, the big living rooms, whatever it was. The things they missed are usually toys, a little necklace, a book, a kiddush cup, a becher, a wine cup, little things like that. Those are things that are meaningful. Again, those are things that form connection, belonging, memories. And I think it's so important to remember, war is not, people always look for great stories about, what have you lost? It's the little small things like those, which how you strip somebody away from their dignity, from their personality, from their identity, because we choose objects that represent who we are. Next, and again, if anybody has any questions, feel free to type them in the chat. This is Mrs. F. I'm not allowed to have a name or a picture. I'm worried that if my name appears anywhere, they may come back for me. You never know. I just saw this lady today, a French lady, and when you come to her house, she closes all the doors and windows. She goes, I don't want anything we say to be heard. You never know who's listening. I think that's quite sad. A lady of 88, that, she's still worried about the Germans coming back. She's worried about somebody using the information about her against her. Again, the power of trauma and the fear. So I said to her today, I'm going to speak about you today. And I'll show you soon some of the images she's created with me. And the first thing she said, make sure nobody knows who you are. You never know who's in the audience. Someone might still come back for me. She goes, I can still hear the boots in my ears every night when I go to sleep. And she's referring to the boots of the German soldiers. She goes, that's something I will never forget. The fear, she goes, the fear has always stayed within me. And she has very complex relationship with her children as well. And she says to me, that's because of the war, because I'm so anxious always of trauma happening, of somebody coming to grab me or my children away again. And I think that's really painful to see. And again, a German soldier walked into her room all those years ago. She still hears the boots. It's affecting the way she interacts with her children, with her grandchildren. What a responsibility do we have as human beings, as individuals, our actions on other people? We really have to stop and think on a personal level. Obviously, I'm not talking about trauma as being part of a war, but even as an individual, to our own household, to our children, to our friends, neighbors, work colleagues, our actions have an impact on others. Next slide. So this is the first image Mrs. F painted with myself. She wasn't talking when she did it. This is the German soldier we just spoke about with the boots. And very interesting, if you look at his face, she made his face, she said she's making his face very neutral. And again, I found it amazing. In the same time, she spoke about the trauma of the sound of his boots. She also spoke about the smell of the shoe polish and how immaculate they were. But she said in the same time, he was a young boy. Perhaps he was forced into this. And that's a theme that comes over and over again. And I think that shows so much character and so much refinement to be able to give someone the benefit of the doubt. And I told her today, we're going to speak about the soldier. She said, please tell everyone, despite the war, despite the pain, despite my anger at the Germans, the world is not only a bad place, she said to me. She said, tell them there's a lot of good. And even within the German soldiers, there were good people. I think that's an amazing message for someone that went through so much trauma and pain. So I've said that. And I hope we internalize that to try and see good in others and give people the benefit of the doubt. Next slide, please. This is also for Mrs. F. And that's a picture once they eventually they were hidden by the farmers in France. She's chosen these two images for you to look at today. So as you look at the corner, there's still the German soldier on the path. That was the constant fear of the Germans coming. And she said they would come regularly and they had to go into hiding. The family, the French family that hid them at the war. And she said she's eternally grateful for them for giving her the love of nature. And she said they are the most important individuals in her life and it's true, she is here because of them. And I think, again, the amount of gratitude she feels towards them, and I'll just give my own personal story about the farmers. So when I grew up all my life, my paternal grandmother was hidden in Holland in the war. And when we would come to my grandmother's house, my grandmother was a real Dutch woman. And she said whatever she thought. It was always, there was no filters. And there was always a picture of this lady on the side, and her name was Trus. Now, I grew up in Israel, and I had no idea it was Trus. And I used to get a bit annoyed sometimes as a kid saying, why is this Dutch woman, which I've never met in my life, has a big picture on the, on the cupboard, and nobody else. What's the? And she always said, "You here?" So my grandmother used to say to me in a very Dutch accent, "You here because of Trus." And only when I was older I could understand actually that yes, I am here because of Trus. Trus is the family that hit them in the war, and they've risked their lives. And often, people said, "Oh, why did other people not hide anybody in the war?" And often, once I had children, I think I suddenly understood and started asking myself, would I risk the life of my own children to save someone else? And the answer, the very honest, frank answer is, I'm not sure. I'm not sure. And I'm being very honest about it. And I think that those people actually put their own life, it's more than just hiding, they put their own life at risk. And it's again talking about seeing there were good people out there. Yes, perhaps they were the minority, but there are good people out there. And I'm here, and I'm thinking about, I'm here. My grandmother, by the time she passed away last year, she had 5 generations. She left 5 generations behind, and quite more than we can count, hundreds of grandchildren, great-grandchildren, and great-grandchildren. And this is all due to Trus, which hit her. And I think that's the same message Mrs. F asked me to tell everyone. There are so many people which are here because individuals risked their lives. There is goodness in the world. And that's a message that comes over and over from survivors. Despite the trauma and the pain, they always say, please remember that not everyone is bad. Next slide, please. Okay. So now I've brought you 2 individuals, and I wanted to give a little bit about people that never left the camps, meaning they've never left the camps mentally. They've obviously left the camps physically. A lot of Holocaust survivors, individuals which spend all their life telling stories. Now, again, I'm saying this carefully, and don't get me wrong. Obviously, it is important. We need people to talk about the Holocaust, and we needed people to record the evidence. But there were individuals like those 2 here, which have spent their whole life obsessively talking about nothing but the Holocaust. They could not leave mentally the camp. So this individual, Meyer Hirsch, he got, I think it's an OBE, honorary from the Queen for his, part in making sure Holocaust education is part of the curriculum in the UK, and the amount of time he spent talking about the Holocaust. But actually, if you look at his eyes, he never left the camps, and it was actually, he just couldn't move forward, and it was heartbreaking to see. This other lady, which I was asked not to tell her name, she was in France. She was in several camps. She was, as well as a camp survivor, she was also a partisan before she was taken to camps. She won the highest award you can get in France for bravery. And the first word whenever you came into a house was, do you know where Auschwitz is? Did you hear about Auschwitz? You couldn't hear any, you never had anything else to talk about. And I think, again, talking about trauma and pain and the length that it affects people and the way it affects, Meyer Hirsch never had children. This other lady left behind a really large family, but as her children told me, we weren't in the camps, but we lived in it all our lives. And I think, again, that's so important to understand, I think, as individuals also, how as 2nd and 3rd generations, and even 4th generation, the fact that the Holocaust is still influencing our relationships, the way we live, the way we think. And as I said, there's so much research now looking at the way it physically changes who we are. It is important to remember that, again, in relation to how we as individuals behave to others around us. Next slide, please. Okay, Margaret. I used to call her Margriet. Next slide. I've put one photo of Margriet. Margriet was, she died when she was 98. She died a couple of years ago. And she came on the Kindertransport. Now, when she left Austria, her mom said to her, don't worry, you go on the train and I will follow. When you come next time to the train station in Britain, I'll be on the train. Well, as we all know, her mom never followed. And she told me, and she was in her late 90s when she said to me, she said, every time she went to the train station, she would still look in the windows of the trains to see if her mom is still there. And she said to me, I know in my head, there's no way even logically my mom would still be alive. But she said to me, the child within me is still waiting. My mom did not keep her promise. And I found that really heartbreaking to hear. And again, how to try and understand how trauma follows somebody all her life. I mean, she said she used to tell me it's a nightmare to go to the train station because I'm always looking for mom in the window. Despite all of that, Margriet lost her belief in God. And I'll just bring a little, again, I said this speech will not be about religion in any way, but I'll just mention that because I thought it was quite interesting. A lot of survivors had the importance of being involved in the community and rebuilding the community naturally. Margriet said always she does not believe in God. She doesn't want to have anything to do with the community. In the same time, she always lived around the Jewish community. When she retired, she moved to Spain. I think it was in Marbella. I'm not going to take the quote of the exact place because I don't remember. And I was going to look it up and I didn't manage. And when Margriet got to Spain, there was no Jewish cemetery where she settled. And she spent hours and hours and raised money to have a Jewish cemetery. And I said to her, Margriet, you don't believe in God. You don't even care anymore about being Jewish, as you said your faith was left in the war. Why are you spending so much time, effort, and money instead of, enjoying the sun? And she looked at me and she said, everybody deserves a grave. Everybody deserves a stone, somewhere that people can come to. And I think that's a subject that comes back a lot also with survivors. The fact that there was nowhere, because people sort of disappeared, there was nowhere, disappeared. Well, they were, died without, in Auschwitz or in different concentration camps, or died and there was no where to come. And I think I could understand slightly that feeling during COVID. So I don't know how it was in other countries, but in the height of the pandemic, people sort of vanished. I felt personally that they vanished because there was no funeral you weren't allowed to go to. There was no Shiva, the week of mourning, you could go to. And you sort of heard somebody disappeared, and then COVID sort of the restriction lifted and you went out and people were gone. And I suddenly understood very little that feeling of somebody just vanishing. Although people, you do have, COVID is different. People do have where to go to, but still that feeling of somebody just gone and you're not sure, and the time plays with reality. But Margriet, again, one of her things was, despite all her pain and trauma, she was a very active person. This picture, again, was taken about a year before she passed away. She was determined to enjoy life and live life to the full. So I'm going to round off because I'm going to go over time as I always do. Sorry. And I will just say, if I conclude what I think the main points that I want you to think about and to take with you when we finish this webinar. So first of all, trauma, when you inflict pain and suffering on others, the effects of them are much greater than you realize. It goes longer and and for a duration of time, and not just for the individuals to generation to come, and that's a responsibility. A second point is, we all have the ability to overcome. Most of us, again, I'm going to say it's reserved. Most of us have the ability to overcome and raise over life challenges with a bit of effort. We have that strength within us. And I've learned that from survivors. I'm saying, again, there was some that could never, but we learned, most of them told me, and I believe it, and I've seen it in my own life, with a bit of resilience, we can do that. Forgiveness, being able to forgive and see the good in others. So like Mrs. F says about the soldier, and like Susan told us and many others, not all of them were bad. There were good people out there. And perhaps if we were in their shoes, would we go with or different? I don't know. But it's about learning to see good in others and giving people the benefit of the doubt. And the other thing I think is the will to live willpower and the quest for life, which I've learned from survivors, is their enormous yearning, sorry, my English, and drive to live life to the full despite the trauma and pain. And in saying all that, we have to remember that there are still individuals still living with us today, which could never get out mentally out of the camps, hiding or losing their families. And their stories are also as equally important as the ones that managed to raise above all of that. I think that's it for today. I'm happy to, Heather's gonna, I think, read some questions if there's any. Hi, Heather.
Hi, wow.
Yeah.
That was very interesting, very thought-provoking. And I feel a little overwhelmed because, you know, we have some wonderful survivors who are still with us here in Cape Town. And if I look at each one of them and the contribution that they make towards memory is phenomenal, because each one is very different.
Yeah.
But that resilience that you talk about, you see the resilience. You see the learning to see the good. And continuously you will have our survivors who will talk about, you know, that you have to look at things a little bit differently. And it can't always be just black and white. So there were a lot of things that you mentioned which really, I kept on hearing an Ella Blumenthal or Miriam Lichterman actually talking about some of the things that you've spoken about. So really it was wonderful.
Thank you.
So there's Joan Ramirez said, this was so rewarding, thank you. And it will help with the character in my novel. By the way, I taught in Cape Town many years ago, rewarding experience, Joan Ramirez. Joan, I don't know what novel you're writing, but we'd like to hear about it when it is finished. From Nadine, incredible thank you. From Zola Schumann, she's a second generation survivor. Both of her parents survived. Wonderful, wonderful people. I never met them, but through Zola, I have been able to learn about, and there was a lot of resilience and talking and getting people together, because as you know, survivors didn't necessarily want to be part of a broader community, but they became their own community in the beginning. So Zola said, so interesting, thank you. There are people who have asked whether it is being recorded. You know, we have, I think, and it's a phenomenon around the world where there's so many different webinars that are on, and everybody wants to see all. So recordings become very important, and sometimes the recordings become more, we have more people watching the recordings than what we have on the webinars. But I have a question about Mr. Lipschitz.
Yeah.
Why did he decide to change his mind and forgive the person who stole the bread out of his pocket?
Okay, so he said to me, which I also thought was so amazing, he said, listen, I survived the war in the end. He said, maybe this piece of bread made him survive. He said, and if that made him survive the war, and he had children and grandchildren, that's my merit. He said, he said, why am I angry? He said to me, what am I angry about? But I think it was him elevating on the basic feeling, again, which amazed me, talking about resilience, being able to raise above trauma, because the trauma of this piece of bread being stolen was obviously so strong. But he got to a point in his life where he thought, you know what, I'm going to get over this and I'm going to forgive. And I found that phenomenal. I heard it from his word, from his mouth, and I could see the tears in his eyes when he said it the first time. It was phenomenal. Moment to witness, and again shows how we all have that ability to forgive when we really have to,
because he forgave it at a later age.
Yes.
So, I mean, he'd actually gone through the bulk of his life not forgiving.
Yes, he said every day when he sliced the bread, he was thinking about this man and feeling anger. And he had always had bread in his house, always had food. We didn't even go down the route of food today, but yeah.
So Zola was saying that her dad's message always was about forgiveness and finding the good too. And I think that certainly is a lesson for all of us, especially in the kind of world that we live today, that we can become quite cynical and maybe we shouldn't. You know, maybe we should be looking at the good, not just necessarily what you're seeing on the outside. So, and then Nadine Gottlieb, we are hearing more and more about intergenerational trauma and the impact of the genetic makeup of the future generations. Yeah. You spoke a little bit about your own experience. At what stage did you realize that some of this intergenerational trauma had come through to you or filtered through to the way you behaved or you lived?
So I think it's interesting. It's an interesting question. So first of all, yes, just from a practical, there's loads of research being done on that, but it's a whole webinar on its own. I think when I moved from Belgium to England and I went to eat with people for a Shabbat meal, and I suddenly realized that some people have exact amount of food on the table. A very interesting one. And I said to people, I remember having a panic feeling in my heart, saying, well, there's only 12 pieces of chicken in this, 12 people. And, you know, and then I used to ask them, are you sure there's enough? And they said, well, what's the problem? And then when I started doing my research, I started interviewing individuals, children of survivors and grandchildren of survivors in the UK. And what they all said to me, you'll realize, they said to me, one child of survivors said to me, you'll realize the real British Jewish families, which have never been to the war, they never have enough food in the house, enough food. And then I started researching. That was my first research when I started doing my first piece of art called Scratches, which I looked at how it affects mother, daughter, and granddaughter. Interestingly, my mom says she doesn't feel the Holocaust affected her as much as other life events. I feel the more I researched and more I looked into it, the more I realized that families of survivors have much more, and I've interviewed a lot of people, much more complex relationships when it comes to landmark events in life, relationship with food, eating disorders, mental health, happiness. And again, it's quite a complex thing, but in England, I felt it very strong. Where I felt very strong, grandchild of survivors, where the war became very real for me was in Belgium. So when I lived in Belgium, I lived in the same streets the Jews were taken away from and the same street they returned to. So the house I lived in was a house where Jews were taken out of and they came straight after the war. There was actually, you've reminded me now, I forgot about her, without names. A lady lived on above me and she was a proper camp survivor. She never left the house. I would hear her screaming, shouting, you know, her husband would tiptoe around the house, you know, a very, your typical traumatized camp survivor. And there I felt the blood still in the streets. I can't explain it. But I think it's very much, if we talk about trauma, and I'll just touch it in short, is that if I look at my siblings, so I'm one of 11, some of us have a really strong connection to the Holocaust and some of us don't think about it. So I do think it has to do with some of your genetic put together, your personality, as well as being a grandchild of survivors. And that's what research goes about. So I definitely feel a really strong connection where some of my siblings don't. So I think it's interesting the way it affects different people. Obviously, that's another research again.
Okay, so Debbie Feldman asked if many of these people did not speak about their experiences beforehand, did you find it difficult to get them to open up to you?
Good question. So first of all, I had a really, I felt very much that recording stories in any price is not allowed. It's not ethical. It's not on. There are many. Last week, a survivor passed away in the UK, where I actually had a nervous breakdown once people decided his story is fascinating. Obviously, not all survivors can talk as well as others. You could have, and I remember seeing him in a care home after he had a nervous breakdown, and I just thought, how could they do it to him? So recording stories is not in every price, and I only recorded individuals that wanted to tell the stories. Now, a lot of people like Mr. Lipschitz never told the story, and he said he never wanted his wife to know about it. He said, how could I let my wife know this pain? She couldn't cope with it. So he was obviously protecting her. Once she passed away, he felt, okay, now it's my time to share the story. Sonia, for example, shared a story for the first time when she was reassured that she has the right to share a story, even though she hasn't been in the camps and she was a small child. So so everybody I spoke to are people that agreed or wanted to speak. If anybody showed any signs of not wanting to tell the story, even though they had a fascinating story, I think we live a bit in a world is nearly, I found it quite challenging, especially when you work with production companies. They're very eager to get the good story, and it's not the right thing to do. Sometimes you just can't. I would never force anybody to tell the story. It is very hard to hear some of those stories first time, so it's a very raw experience when you hear someone in the late 80s or 90s opening up for the first time in their lives. I must say there were some sleepless nights after some of the stories, and I heard a lot of recordings. What we did make sure is those people have psychological help to follow. So it was very sort of controlled, if that makes sense, to make sure for their welfare as well.
Mm. Well, unfortunately, production companies generally don't have the sensitivity. It's all about the story.
Yeah.
At whatever cost. Okay, so Gideon, I think it may be his Leventhal. I had the privilege to meet Mr. Lipschitz. One after him with him stays with you for a lifetime. Endeavor, determination, charm, and faith. And he also then says you couldn't leave his home without him pressing biscuits or fruits into your home.
Hi, Gideon. Yeah, Gideon is right about that. So Gideon does amazing, by the way. Gideon Leventhal does amazing work about Holocaust education in the schools. I'm not sure your title exactly, Gideon, so do forgive me. But he's head of, I think, history and head of Yavne Boys School. And forgive me for the title. He does incredible work with Holocaust education. And yes, Mr. Lipschitz, I remember one before Shabbat, I got an urgent call. He was calling, and he said, I've made you some apple compote from the apples from my tree. You need to come now and have it. So yes, it was urgent. So again, you always had food from him. He was a lovely guy.
Okay, so I think we'll just round off with two. Rahama Jaffa says, go mom.
That's my future daughter-in-law. Thanks, Rahama. Okay. I didn't know she's here.
Chava's son got engaged, so this is all very exciting now. From Zola again, thank you for this incredible work you do and the dignity and sensitivity with which you do it and share with others.
Thank you.
And I think that really says everything, Chava. I think it's not easy to work with survivors when you are trying to heal the trauma that they have gone through. And I would imagine that it is very difficult and it is traumatic for you to listen. But I think that these stories are important for us to hear about. And if we don't have people like yourself who agree to talk about their experiences, we will never be able to really say never again. Because I think that the story that is given by a second or third or fourth generation becomes more real than somebody who's from the outside who hasn't really experienced that. As passionate as what you may feel about it, there's a nuance that is missing. So thank you so much. Thank you to Rafi, your son, for all of the help that he has given us over the last few months. I wish you lots of luck, and I hope that we will see you again.
Thank you so much. Thanks to you. Have a good night.
And thank you to all for joining. Good night.
Good night.